The alarms started screaming at exactly 3:47 in the morning, and every military officer on Earth woke up to the same message on their screens. Unknown fleet detected near Jupiter, vessel count exceeding 14,000. Admiral Yuki Tanaka was drinking her second coffee of the night when her aide burst through the door of her office at United Fleet Command in Geneva and slapped a tablet onto her desk with shaking hands. She looked at the readings and then looked again, and then set her coffee down very slowly. 14,000 ships, she said out loud, as if saying the number would make it feel more real. Yes, Admiral, her aide stammered, and they are big. Some of them are the size of small moons. Tanaka picked her coffee back up and took a long sip. She had been in the military for 31 years. She had trained for every possible scenario, including alien invasion. But nothing in the training manuals covered an armada that could blot out Jupiter from view. Across the solar system, humanity held its breath. The United Nations Emergency Council assembled in record time, connecting leaders from every nation and colony through quantum-linked channels. The faces on the screens were pale and tense. Some were praying. Others were already giving orders to their militaries. And then the alien broadcast began. Every screen on Earth, every phone, every billboard, every holographic display in every city on every colony, all of them flickered and showed the same image. A towering figure appeared, easily 12 feet tall, with 6 muscular arms and a head like a massive insect covered in sharp ridges. His eyes burned with a cold golden light, and his armor, if it could be called armor, appeared to be made from actual bones, fused together with some kind of dark metal. He stood on what looked like a throne made of skulls, and behind him stretched an endless hall, filled with soldiers that looked just like him, only smaller. Spoke, and his voice shook the speakers of every device on the planet. I am Lord Vethan the Undying, supreme hegemon of the Ja'Kari Imperial Dominion, conqueror of 900 worlds, devourer of the weak, and architect of eternal order. He paused to let that sink in, and then he continued. Your world has been observed. Your species has been measured. You are small. You are fragile. You are alone. And now you belong to me. What followed was a speech that lasted exactly 40 minutes. The Ja'Kari called it the Litany of Inevitable Subjugation, and it was apparently a very famous piece of oratory in the wider galaxy. Vethan recited the names of 312 civilizations that his empire had conquered or destroyed. He described in vivid detail what had happened to species that resisted. Entire worlds burned to glass, populations reduced to genetic archives stored in jars, cultures erased so completely that even the memory of them was gone. About his empire's divine right to rule all living things. He described the biological modifications that would be made to humanity to make them suitable servants, extra joints for labor efficiency, reduced brain capacity for obedience, chemical suppression of unnecessary emotions. He ended with a phrase that had apparently made entire planets surrender on the spot, kneel or be rendered into dust and memory. The broadcast ended. The golden eyes faded from the screens. Silence fell across the solar system for about 9 seconds. Then someone in the UN Emergency Council unmuted their microphone and snorted. It was the delegate from Brazil. He tried to cover it with a cough, but it was too late. The delegate from South Korea started giggling. The British Prime Minister pressed her lips together so hard they turned white, but a laugh escaped through her nose like a tiny explosion. And then Admiral Tanaka, the woman who was supposed to coordinate humanity's military response to the greatest threat it had ever faced, leaned back in her chair and started laughing so hard that tears rolled down her cheeks. Within minutes, the entire emergency council had dissolved into chaos. Not the panic kind of chaos, the funny kind. Every serious face on every screen was red and shaking with laughter. someone played back the part where Vethon called himself the Devourer of the Weak, and half the council lost it all over again. The Secretary General tried to restore order 3 times, and failed, because he kept laughing himself. "His armor is made of bones," wheezed the Australian representative, wiping her eyes. "He literally wears a bone suit, and sits on a skull throne. It is like a heavy metal album cover came to life." "Did he say he was going to give us extra joints?" the Canadian Prime Minister asked, barely holding it together. "For labor efficiency? What does that even mean?" "I want a poster of him for my office," said the Japanese Defense Minister, and the whole council broke down again. The laughter spread fast. Within an hour, the entire human internet had the litany of inevitable subjugation in its teeth. Someone auto-tuned Vethon's speech into a dance track within 90 minutes, and it was already climbing the charts. The phrase, "kneel or be rendered into dust and memory," became the biggest meme humanity had produced in a decade. People were printing it on shirts, mugs, and bumper stickers. A college student in Mexico City made a 10-second animation of Vethon doing a little dance, and it was shared 400 million times before sunrise. Nobody was scared. That was the part that would have confused any other species in the galaxy. Every civilization that had ever heard the litany had reacted the same way, with terror, with despair, with immediate and total surrender. But humans looked at a 12-foot insect king in a bone suit, sitting on a skull throne, telling them he was going to modify their joints, and their first instinct was to make fun of him. Far above Earth, in the command center of his flagship, a vessel called the Eternal Silence that was roughly the size of a small continent. Lord Vethon waited for the surrender transmission. He had done this hundreds of times. He knew the timing. The target species would weep, they would beg, they would offer tributes. It usually took less than an hour. An hour passed. No surrender came. 2 hours. Nothing. 6 hours, and Scholar Keel, Vethon's chief advisor, a thin and quiet Jacari, who had studied more alien cultures than anyone alive, walked onto the command deck with a datapad clutched in his 4 hands, and a look on his face that Vethon had never seen before. "Supreme Hegemon," Keel said slowly, "I have been monitoring the human communication networks." "And?" Vethon demanded. "Surrender?" Keel was silent for a moment. Then he turned the datapad around and showed Vethon the screen. It displayed a crude drawing of the Supreme Hegemon, wearing a party hat, with the caption, "This guy really said kneel or be rendered into dust and memory. Like, bro, you are a bug in a costume, sit down." Vethon stared at it. His golden eyes narrowed. "What is this?" he asked. "They call it a meme, Supreme Hegemon," Keel replied quietly. "And there are approximately 400 million of them already." Vethon looked at the screen for a long time. Then he looked out the viewport, at the tiny blue planet hanging in the darkness of space. The planet that was supposed to be begging for mercy right now, but was instead making fun of his armor. "They are not afraid," he said, and it was not a question. "No, Supreme Hegemon," Keel confirmed. "They are not afraid at all. In fact, I believe the correct human term for what they are doing is laughing at us." The bridge of the Eternal Silence went very quiet. No one in the Jacari Empire had ever said those words before. No species had ever laughed at them. There was no protocol for this. There was no contingency plan. There was nothing in 1,000 years of conquest that covered the possibility that the target species would simply find the whole thing funny. And somewhere on Earth, a comedian was already writing a stand-up set about the bone suit, and the ticket sales were through the roof. 72 hours had passed since the litany of inevitable subjugation, and Lord Vethon, the Undying, was experiencing something no enemy had ever managed to inflict upon him in 1,000 years of conquest: a headache. He sat in his command throne aboard the Eternal Silence, his 6 arms gripping the armrests, his golden eyes fixed on the massive display screen that Scholar Keel had set up in the center of the bridge. The screen was cycling through what Kiel called a representative sample of the human response to their arrival. Vethan watched in rigid silence as his own face, the face that had made emperors weep and civilizations crumble, scrolled past in an endless parade of absurdity. In one image, his head had been placed on the body of a small earth animal called a chicken. In another, his litany speech had been cut and edited so that it sounded like he was singing a love song. Someone had recreated his skull throne using what appeared to be candy, and posted it with the words, "I made the alien king's chair out of gummy bears. Took me about 3 hours." A video showed a human child, no more than 6 years old, wearing a cardboard costume with 6 arms made of paper towel tubes, stomping around a living room and shouting, "Kneel or be rendered into dust," while a woman laughed so hard in the background that she could barely hold the camera. "Turn it off," Vethan said. "Supreme Hegemon, I believe you need to see the full extent of—" "Turn it off, Kiel." Kiel turned it off, but the damage was already done, and both of them knew it. The problem was not just the mockery. The problem was that the mockery was spreading, and not just among humans. 3 days into what the human media had cheerfully dubbed the meme war, the intercepted communications told a troubling story. The Zakari Armada consisted of 14,000 ships, and each of those ships carried between 500 and 10,000 crew members. Those crew members were low-caste drones, soldiers bred for obedience, engineered to follow orders without question, biologically incapable of independent thought. Or at least that was what the Empire had always believed. Kiel stood before the War Council, a gathering of Vethan's 12 most senior generals, and delivered his report with the careful precision of someone explaining that the building they were all standing in was on fire. "The human broadcasts are being intercepted by our communication arrays," he began. "This is expected. Their signals are primitive and unencrypted. What was not expected is that our drone-cast soldiers have been listening." General Krath, the largest and most decorated officer in the fleet, made a dismissive sound. "Drones do not think. They hear noise, nothing more." "That was my initial assumption as well," Kiel replied. "However, I have documented 417 incidents across the fleet in the last 48 hours of drone soldiers exhibiting behaviors." "What kind of behaviors?" Vethan asked. Kiel hesitated, which was something he almost never did. "They are making sounds, Supreme Hegemon, sounds that do not correspond to any known Jakari vocalization. A kind of rapid chittering, accompanied by involuntary spasms of the thorax. It appears to be triggered by exposure to human broadcast content, particularly the memes." The War Council stared at him. "Are you telling me," General Kraft said very slowly, "that the drones are laughing?" "I am telling you that they are doing something, General, and I do not have a better word for it." The room erupted. Every general spoke at once. Some demanded that all human signals be jammed immediately. Others called for the execution of affected drones. General Kraft slammed 2 of his fists on the table and roared that this was a weapon, that the humans were deploying some kind of psychological virus. Through their broadcasts, Vethan raised one hand, and the room went silent. "Jam their signals," he ordered. "All of them. Every frequency. Block everything." It took the Zakari communication officers exactly 4 hours to implement a total signal blackout across the fleet. For 4 hours, silence reigned. No human broadcasts reached the Armada. No memes, no music, no auto-tuned speeches, no dancing animations. And then, the humans noticed. Admiral Yuki Tanaka was in her office when her communications officer reported that the Zakari had blocked all incoming transmissions. She leaned back in her chair, crossed her arms, and smiled. "They jammed us," she said. "Good. That means it was working." "What do we do now, Admiral?" "We knock on the door," Tanaka said. What happened next would later be studied in military academies across the galaxy as either the most brilliant or the most insane tactical communication maneuver in recorded history. Could not send radio signals through the Shakari jamming field. So instead, they sent physical objects, Within 6 hours, Earth's orbital manufacturing platforms had produced approximately 2 million small, cheap, self-propelled drones, each one about the size of a human fist. Each drone carried a tiny projector and a battery that would last about 20 minutes. And each one was loaded with a single piece of content, a meme, a joke, a short video, a clip of humans laughing. They launched them all at once, in a massive cloud that drifted through the jamming field like a swarm of glowing insects, and settled among the Jacari fleet. The drones were too small and too numerous to shoot down effectively, and they attached themselves to the hulls of the warships like barnacles, projecting their content onto every surface they could find. Jacari soldiers on routine hull patrols suddenly found themselves face to face with glowing holographic projections of Lord Vethon. Wearing a party hat, engineering teams reported tiny drones in the ventilation systems playing the auto-tuned litany dance track on loop. One drone somehow made it onto the bridge of General Kraft's flagship and projected an image of the general with cartoon hearts around his head, and the caption, "This big guy just needs a hug." Kraft destroyed the drone with his bare hands, but 17 of his bridge officers had already seen it. 3 of them made the sound, the chittering sound, the one that might have been laughter, down in the lower decks of every ship in the fleet. Away from the eyes of officers and generals, the drone soldiers gathered around the tiny glowing projections and watched. They did not understand everything they saw. Human humor was strange to them, built on references and wordplay and cultural context that was completely alien. But they understood the core of it. They understood that these small, soft creatures on the blue planet were looking at the most powerful empire in the galaxy, and they were not afraid. They were laughing, and laughter, it turned out, was contagious in ways that no Jacari scientist had ever predicted. Scholar Keel tracked the spread of what he began privately calling the infection with growing alarm. The chittering incidents doubled, then tripled. He documented a case of 2 drone soldiers attempting to recreate a human joke. They did not understand why it was funny, but they made the sounds anyway, as if their bodies were learning something their minds had not yet caught up to. He filed a report that used the phrase, cultural contamination at a biological level, and sent it directly to Vethon. Meanwhile, Admiral Tanaka opened a formal diplomatic channel and requested a face-to-face meeting. Her message was polite, professional, and warm. She proposed neutral ground, a station near Saturn. She expressed genuine interest in learning about the Jacari and their civilization. She signed off with her official title and rank. Under her dress uniform, she wore a t-shirt that read, "I survived the litany of inevitable subjugation, and all I got was this lousy t-shirt." She had ordered 500 of them for her crew, and they had sold out in 11 minutes. Vethon accepted the meeting. He told his generals it was a tactical decision, that he would assess the humans in person and find the weakness that clearly existed somewhere beneath all the laughing. He told himself the same thing. But late that night, alone in his quarters, he pulled up Kiel's latest report on his personal screen, and read the section that Kiel had marked as critical. It was a summary of human history, not their military capabilities or their technology, but their actual history as a species. Kiel had studied it obsessively for 3 days, and his conclusion sat at the bottom of the page in quiet, careful words. The humans have endured catastrophic wars that killed hundreds of millions of their own kind. They have survived plagues, famines, ice ages, and self-inflicted disasters that would have ended most species. They have built weapons capable of destroying their own world many times over, and they have come close to using them. And through all of it, through every horror their existence has produced, they laughed. They made jokes in the trenches of their wars. They wrote comedy during their plagues. They found humor in the shadow of their own extinction. They laugh, Supreme Hegemon, because they have seen worse than us. They have seen themselves. Vethon read those words 3 times, Then he closed the screen and sat in the dark for a very long time. And for the first time in 1,000 years, the Undying felt something cold settle in his chest that he did not have a name for. It was not fear exactly. It was the beginning of understanding that he had picked a fight with something the galaxy had never seen before. Titan Station had been built in 11 days, which was apparently some kind of record for human engineering. It hung in orbit around Saturn's largest moon like a spinning silver coin, sleek and functional, and just large enough to hold a diplomatic meeting between two species that had very different ideas about how the next few days were going to go. Lord Vethon arrived first. He brought 200 of his finest warriors, the Thorn Guard, each one standing 9 feet tall, encased in the living bone armor that was the signature of the Imperial elite. They marched through the docking corridor in perfect formation, their footsteps shaking the metal floor, their conquest pheromones flooding the air ahead of them like an invisible wave. The pheromones were a biological weapon of sorts, a chemical cocktail engineered over centuries to trigger submission responses in carbon-based life forms. Entire delegations from other species had dropped to their knees the moment they caught the scent, weeping and trembling before Vethon even entered the room. The human welcoming party consisted of Admiral Tanaka, 12 diplomatic staff, 8 Marines in dress uniform, and a man named Corporal Reyes, who was carrying a tray of sandwiches because someone had suggested that offering food might be a nice gesture. The pheromones hit them about 30 seconds before the Jacari entered the room. Admiral Tanaka sniffed the air, her nose wrinkled. "Does anyone else smell cinnamon?" she asked. "Cinnamon and something else," said Corporal Reyes, frowning at his sandwich tray. "Like old gym socks, maybe a little bit of nutmeg." One of the Marines sneezed violently 3 times in a row, wiped his nose and said, "Sorry, allergies." The doors opened, and the Thorn Guard marched in. Their armor gleamed under the station lights. Conquest pheromones poured off them in visible waves. The temperature in the room seemed to drop. The guards took their positions. Along the walls, perfectly still, perfectly terrifying. The Marine who had sneezed leaned over to Corporal Reyes and whispered, "Big lads, aren't they?" "Absolutely massive," Reyes whispered back. "You think they work out, or is that just how they come?" "Genetic engineering, probably. That feels like cheating." Lord Vethon entered last. He was the tallest figure in the room by a wide margin. His golden eyes swept across the human delegation with the cold assessment of a predator evaluating prey. His 6 arms were folded across his chest, and his bone armor, which included the fused skulls of 3 different conquered species across his shoulders, caught the light in ways that were clearly designed to be deeply unsettling. Admiral Tanaka stepped forward and extended her hand. "Lord Vethon, welcome to Titan Station. We are honored by your presence," she said. Vethon looked at her hand. He did not take it. "You are smaller than I expected," he said. Voice filled the room like rolling thunder. "I get that a lot," Tanaka replied cheerfully. "Please, sit down. We have prepared refreshments." Reyes held up the sandwich tray with a hopeful expression. Vethon stared at it as if it were an insult, which in his culture it probably was. The negotiation began, and it went wrong for the Jacari almost immediately. Vethon has script. He had used it on hundreds of species. The first phase was physical intimidation, a demonstration of raw power that would establish dominance and set the tone for surrender. So exactly 12 minutes into the discussion, when Tanaka made her opening proposal for mutual non-aggression, Vethon stood to his full height, raised one massive fist, and brought it crashing down through the center of the negotiation table. The table, which was made of reinforced titanium alloy, split clean in half. The sound was enormous. Papers and datapads flew in every direction. Reyes dropped the sandwich. For a moment, the room was silent. Then the human delegation burst into applause. "Oh, that was brilliant," said one of the diplomatic staff, clapping enthusiastically. "Did you see that? One hit clean through. How strong is this guy?" "Can you do that again?" asked a Marine, already holding up his phone to record. "My wife will never believe this." Vethon stood over the destroyed table with his fist still embedded in the wreckage, and stared at the clapping humans with an expression that Scholar Kiel, watching from the back of the room, could only describe as deeply confused. It got worse. Vethon moved to Phase 2, Psychological Horror. He activated a holographic display and showed the human delegation footage of worlds he had conquered. Burning cities, fleeing populations, entire civilizations reduced to ash. The recordings were vivid and brutal, the kind of imagery that had driven diplomats of other species to vomit, faint, or simply surrender. On the spot, to make it stop, the human cultural attaché, a thin woman named Dr. Elena Vasquez, who had apparently spent 20 years studying documentary filmmaking, leaned forward with genuine interest and said, "The framing on this is actually incredible. Is this shot from orbit or from a ship in atmosphere? Because the way the light catches the fires is really something. Who filmed this?" Vethon turned off the hologram. Phase 3 was the Dance of Annihilation, a ritual war display performed by the Thorn Guard that combined martial arts, weapon demonstrations, and a kind of rhythmic stomping that produced infrasound waves designed to trigger panic responses in most biological organisms. 20 warriors stepped forward and began the dance. Their bone weapons flashed, the floor shook, the infrasound hit the humans like a wall of invisible pressure. 3 Marines started filming. One of them tilted his head and said, "This would absolutely destroy on social media." "The choreography is tight," whispered another Marine. "Like really tight. They must practice a lot." Admiral Tanaka watched the entire display with polite attention and clapped when it was over. "That was very impressive. Thank you for sharing your culture with us." She paused and then added with perfect diplomatic warmth, "Now, shall we discuss the trade agreement?" Vethon had been a conqueror for 1,000 years. He had broken species that wielded weapons capable of tearing holes in reality. He had crushed empires that spanned entire galactic arms. And he was losing a negotiation to a short woman who kept offering him sandwiches. He tried direct threats. He told Tanaka that his fleet could reduce Earth to molten glass in 6 hours. Tanaka nodded thoughtfully and said, "That is interesting. Our models estimated 8 hours, so you are actually faster than we thought, which is honestly impressive." He tried insults. He called humanity weak, primitive, insignificant, a species barely worth the effort of conquering. Tanaka agreed that humans were relatively new to space travel, and said she hoped the Ja'Kari might be willing to share some of their technological knowledge through a cultural exchange program. He tried silence, the long, crushing, predatory silence that had made ambassadors crack and beg. He stared at Tanaka without blinking for 4 full minutes. Tanaka stared back, smiled, and used the pause to eat one of Reyes's sandwiches. Nothing worked. Nothing had ever not worked before. Scholar Kiel watched all of this from his position at the back of the room, and he understood what was happening, even if Vethon did not. The humans were not being brave. They were not performing courage for show. They were genuinely, completely, unshakably amused by the entire situation. Every tool in the Ja'Kari intimidation arsenal, the pheromones, the strength displays, the horror footage, the war dances, the threats, the silence, all of it bounced off the humans like pebbles off a warship hull, because the humans simply did not find any of it frightening. They found it interesting. They found it entertaining. They found it, in many cases, endearing. It was like watching someone try to scare a species that had already invented every possible fear and gotten bored of all of them. The breaking point came when Tanaka presented her formal counter-proposal. She slid a datapad across the ruined table, balancing it on the jagged edge where Vethon's fist had split the metal, and outlined a comprehensive plan for peace, trade, cultural exchange, and mutual defense. We would also be happy to help you update your brand, she added. And I say this with respect, but the bone armor look is very, how do I put this, early 2000s metal band. And while I personally appreciate the commitment to the aesthetic, I think there is room for a refresh. Vethon stood. He towered over every human in the room, burned his 6 fists clenched. Diplomacy has failed, he said in a voice that shook the walls. You will not submit. You will not kneel. You will not take this seriously. We are taking this very seriously, Tanaka said. This is just what serious looks like for us. Then you leave me no choice. Vethon turned to his Thornguard. We return to the fleet. The invasion begins. He strode toward the door, his warriors falling into formation behind him. The footsteps were heavy and final. The humans watched them go. But Scholar Keel did not follow immediately. He stopped at the door and turned back to face Admiral Tanaka. The room was quiet, just the two of them in the wreckage of the table and the scattered sandwiches. You want us to attack, Keel said softly, do you not? Tanaka's smile did not change, but something shifted behind her eyes, something sharp and old and patient. Scholar Keel, she said, we have been waiting for someone to test our toys on, for a very, very long time. Keel studied her face for a moment. Then he gave a small nod, turned and walked out to join his master. As the Jacari shuttle detached from Titan Station and accelerated back toward the fleet, Keel sat in silence and thought about what he had seen in that woman's eyes. It was not cruelty, it was not bloodlust, it was something stranger and more frightening than either. It was confidence, the deep, unshakable, almost cheerful confidence of a species that had fought itself so many times and so viciously that a war with aliens was not a nightmare. The Jacari Imperial fleet moved toward Earth like a slow-closing fist. 14,000 warships in layered attack formations, arranged with the mathematical precision of a civilization that had been perfecting the art of conquest for 1,000 years. Dreadnoughts the size of mountains formed the core. Flanking wings of cruisers and destroyers spread outward in crescent patterns that had crushed every fleet they had ever faced. Behind them came the siege platforms, massive floating factories that could crack a planet's crust like an eggshell. And woven through all of it, like a dark cloud of metal teeth, came the drone swarms, billions of autonomous killing machines that could strip a world bare in hours. It was the single most powerful military force ever assembled in one place in the recorded history of the galaxy. Humanity fielded 612 ships. Across the galaxy, species that had been secretly monitoring the situation through stolen signals and hidden observation probes watched with a mixture of horror and resignation. They had seen this before. The Jacari would sweep through the human defenses like fire through dry grass. The blue planet would burn. The strange laughing species would join the list of 312 names in the litany. It was inevitable. And then the humans started broadcasting. Every channel, every frequency, completely unencrypted, wide open for the entire galaxy to hear. 2 retired admirals, a cheerful British woman named Margaret Chen, and a loud American man named Roberto Santos, appeared on screen, sitting behind a desk with coffee mugs and holographic tactical displays. Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening to everyone across the Sol system and beyond, said Admiral Chen with a warm smile. Welcome to what we are calling the Battle of Sol, brought to you live, uninterrupted, and completely uncensored. I am Admiral Margaret Chen, retired. Santos, also retired, and let me just say, Maggie, 14,000 ships, that is a lot of ships. It is indeed a lot of ships, Roberto. We have 600. We do. Should be fun. I think so, yes. Across the Jacari fleet, communication officers reported the broadcast to their commanders. Lord Vethon, standing on the bridge of the eternal silence, listened to the two humans chatting casually about the approaching apocalypse, as if they were discussing the weather, and felt that nameless cold thing in his chest tighten another notch. Scholar Kiel stood beside him, quiet as always. "They are treating this as entertainment," he said. "I can see that," Vethon growled. "No, Supreme Hegemon. I mean they are literally treating it as entertainment. Betting markets have opened on Earth. The current odds are 12 to 1 in favor of humanity. The most popular wager is not whether they will win, but how quickly." Vethon said nothing, raised his hand, and gave the order to attack. The Zakari fleet surged forward, and the human ships came to meet them. The first thing the Zakari noticed was that the human ships were ugly. There was no other word for it. Where Zakari vessels were sleek and symmetrical, designed to project power and inspire terror, human warships looked like they had been assembled in a hurry by people who cared more about function than form. They were angular, brutal, asymmetric, covered in what appeared to be welded-on armor plates and exposed weapon systems. Some of them had actual writing painted on their hulls. The destroyer at the front of the formation bore the name USS Fuck Around and Find Out, in letters 3 stories tall. "That is their lead ship?" General Krath asked from his own bridge, squinting at the readings. "It appears so, General," his aide confirmed. "What does that name mean?" His aide, who had been studying human language databases, went very quiet for a moment and said, "It is a colloquial expression, General. It roughly translates to a warning that hostile actions will result in severe and disproportionate consequences." Said Krath. "Noted." The two fleets met at the edge of the asteroid belt, and the battle began. The Zakari opened with standard Imperial doctrine, long-range bombardments from the dreadnoughts, designed to soften the enemy formation before the cruisers closed in for systematic destruction. Thousands of energy beams lanced across the void, each one powerful enough to melt through a kilometer of solid rock. The human ships dodged, not in organized, predictable way, not with the kind of disciplined, evasive maneuvers that military forces used across the galaxy. The human ships dodged like, Kiel searched for the right comparison, like animals, like wild, unpredictable, furious animals. They scattered, and then they charged. Not as a fleet, but as 600 individual acts of creative violence. A human frigate, barely a tenth the size of a Zakari cruiser, accelerated to an insane speed, flew directly into the gap between two dreadnoughts, and detonated a weapon that produced a gravitational shockwave so intense that both dreadnoughts were pulled into each other and crumpled like paper. A squadron of human fighters, tiny ships with crews of 2 or 3, latched onto the hull of a Zakari carrier and began cutting through the armor with mining lasers that had very clearly been modified for exactly this purpose. When Zakari soldiers in spacesuits came out to stop them, the human pilots ejected from their fighters and fought them hand-to-hand in the vacuum of space using magnetic boots and what appeared to be heavily modified construction tools. The USS Fuck Around and Find Out lived up to its name. It drove straight into the heart of the Zakari formation like a bull in a china shop, absorbing hits that should have destroyed it 3 times over. Its armor held, not because it was technologically superior, but because someone had apparently bolted on so many extra layers of scrap metal that the ship was essentially a flying bunker. It rammed a Zakari dreadnought head-on, punching clean through the hull, emerged from the other side, trailing fire and debris, and kept going. "Did that ship just ram through a dreadnought?" Admiral Chen asked on the live broadcast, her eyebrows raised. "It did, Maggie. It absolutely did, and it looks like it is lining up to do it again." "That cannot be standard doctrine." "I do not think doctrine is a word that applies to these people. On the open communication channels, human pilots talk to each other and to the Zakari with the casual energy of people playing a competitive sport. Raptor 7, you have 3 bogeys on your 6. Copy that. Ooh, make that 2. Nice shot, Raptor 4. Thanks. Hey bug guys, you might want to check your shields on the port side. They seem a little thin. Raptor 7, stop taunting the enemy fleet. Come on, Lieutenant, they started it. They literally said kneel or be dust. Somewhere in the chaos, someone on a human ship began broadcasting music. A heavy, rhythmic song, with pounding drums and screaming guitars, filled every open channel in the battle zone. The Zakari communication officers could not shut it out. It was being transmitted on every frequency simultaneously, and the humans seemed to have an endless supply of songs queued up. A playlist title appeared on the Zakari command screens. Songs to Get Conquered To, a collaborative playlist by the people of Earth. General Kraft's flagship took a direct hit that killed the engines and set 3 decks on fire. As his crews scrambled to contain the damage, Kraft stood at the viewport and watched a human cruiser physically spin, rotating on its axis like a top, while firing in every direction at once. It was not elegant, it was not precise, it was the most terrifyingly effective thing he had ever seen. They fight like they are insane, he said quietly. No, General, said his aide, who was watching the human broadcast while simultaneously coordinating damage control. I think they fight like they are having fun. The battle lasted 11 hours. By the end of it, the Zakari had lost 9,400 ships. Humanity had lost 74, and most of those crews had survived because their escape pods were, in a design choice that Scholar Kiel would later describe as profoundly human, also weapons. The pods would eject, drift toward the nearest enemy ship, and then magnetically attach to the hull and begin cutting through it while the crew inside waited for pickup. The surviving Zakari fleet, battered, burning, and deeply confused, pulled back toward Jupiter. Lord Vethon stood on the bridge of the Eternal Silence, which was missing approximately 40% of its hull. His armor was cracked, his golden eyes were dim, one of his 6 arms hung limp at his side, injured by a falling beam during a hull breach. The battle was over. The Zakari had not been merely defeated, they had been outfought by a force a fraction of their size, and the entire galaxy had watched it happen, live with commentary. A final transmission arrived from Admiral Tanaka. It appeared on Vethayon's personal screen, flagged as a direct private message. He opened it. It was an image. His own face, carefully edited, wearing the oversized red nose and colorful wig of a human clown. Beneath it, in bold letters, were the words, "The Litany of Inevitable Skill Issue." Vethayon stared at it. The bridge was silent around him. Broken consoles sparked. Wounded officers groaned. The vast viewport showed the wreckage of his fleet, drifting against the distant light of the sun. And Lord Vethayon the Undying, supreme hegemon of the Zakari Imperial Dominion, conqueror of 900 worlds, made a sound. It started in his chest, somewhere deep and unfamiliar. It rose through his throat like something that had been locked away for centuries. It came out as a short, sharp bark, followed by another, and then another. His shoulders shook. His cracked armor rattled. His officers turned to stare at him with open alarm, because none of them had ever heard a Zakari make that sound before. Scholar Kiel heard it from across the bridge, and he closed his eyes and let out a long, slow breath. 6 months after the Battle of Sol, the galaxy was different, and nobody was entirely sure whether that was a good thing or a terrifying thing, but it was definitely an interesting thing. And if humanity had taught the universe one lesson in its short time on the galactic stage, it was that interesting was always better than boring. Lord Vethon the Undying requested peace. That sentence alone would have been enough to send shockwaves through every inhabited system in the galaxy. The Zakari did not ask for peace. They imposed it, or they destroyed whatever was in their way. No species in 1,000 years had ever forced the Empire to the negotiating table, and no supreme hegemon had ever been the one to make the request. But Vethon did. and the reason was sitting in his quarters in the form of a 700-page document written by scholar Kiel, titled On the Nature of Humans, A Warning. Kiel had spent the 6 months since the battle studying everything he could find about the human species. He had read their histories, watched their entertainment, analyzed their social structures, studied their wars, their art, their religions, their jokes. He had spent 3 weeks doing nothing but watching what humans called stand-up comedy, a ritual where one human stood alone on a stage and attempted to make a room full of other humans laugh, and was judged successful or unsuccessful based on whether the laughter was genuine. He found it fascinating and deeply alarming in equal measure. The report's conclusion was simple, and Kiel wrote it in the plainest language he could manage, so that even the most stubborn general in the War Council would understand it. Humans cannot be conquered because they cannot be intimidated. They cannot be intimidated because they have already survived themselves. Their history is a catalogue of self-inflicted catastrophes that would have ended any other species. Wars that killed hundreds of millions. That could crack their own planet. Plagues and famines and environmental disasters brought about by their own choices. And through every one of these horrors, they did something that no other known species has ever done. They laughed. Humor is not a quirk of human culture. It is their primary survival mechanism. It is how they process fear, how they bond under pressure, how they strip power from things that threaten them. When a human laughs at something, that thing loses its ability to control them. This is why our intimidation failed. This is why our pheromones failed. This is why the litany failed. They looked at everything we are, 1,000 years of conquest, 900 subjugated worlds, an armada that blots out stars, and they saw a joke. To fight humans is to become a joke. And in a galaxy ruled by fear, there is nothing more dangerous than a species that finds everything funny. Vethon read the report 3 times. Read it. Then he sent the peace request. The treaty was signed on Titan Station, the same station where the first disastrous negotiation had taken place. The table had been replaced. Admiral Tanaka and Lord Vethon sat across from each other, surrounded by diplomats and officers from both sides. Tanaka wore her dress uniform. Vethon wore his bone armor, though he had removed the skulls from the shoulders, a concession that, in Jacari culture, was roughly equivalent to showing up in casual clothes. The terms were generous on both sides: mutual non-aggression, trade routes, cultural exchange programs, technology sharing, and one clause that Tanaka had personally insisted on: full rights and protections for the Jacari drone caste, including access to education, cultural material, and this was the part that made the generals uncomfortable: humor. Your drones are people, Tanaka said during the final session. They deserve to laugh. Moment, and then he signed. What happened next unfolded faster than anyone expected, faster than the Jacari were prepared for, and faster than even the humans had planned. Humanity spread outward. Not as conquerors, they had no interest in ruling other species. They spread the way humans had always spread, with noise and chaos and enthusiasm and an absolute inability to leave anything the way they found it. The first human comedy club opened on Jacral Prime, the Jacari homeworld, within 2 months of the treaty. It was called the Skull Throne, and it was run by a retired Marine named Davis, who had somehow convinced a local landlord to rent him a basement in the capital city. The first few shows were disasters. The Jacari audience sat in rigid silence, because they had no framework for what was happening to them. A small, soft alien was standing on a raised platform and talking, and the words were supposed to produce a physical response, but nothing came. Davis told a joke about the litany of inevitable subjugation. A simple, silly joke about how long it was, and how Vethon must have been tired after giving the same 40-minute speech to every planet he visited. And did he ever lose his place and have to start over? One drone in the back of the room chittered, then another, Then the whole room was making the sound, that strange, rapid, involuntary tittering that Kiel had first documented 6 months ago. It was not quite laughter, not in the way humans understood it, but it was close. It was the beginning of something. Within weeks, the comedy club was packed every night. Davis hired local Zakari performers, mostly drones, who turned out to have a completely unexpected talent for physical comedy. Their routines were strange and alien, and often did not make sense to the human audience members. But there was something about watching a 9-foot insectoid creature pretend to trip over its own 6 legs that transcended cultural barriers. The laughter spread. On the Zakari colony world of Verith 9, a group of drone soldiers, who had been stationed there for decades, performing the same repetitive labor tasks day after day without complaint, because they had been engineered not to complain, watched a human comedy broadcast for the first time, and something broke open inside them. They did not rebel, they did not fight, they simply stopped working for 1 hour, gathered in the barracks, and practiced making the chittering sound together. Their overseer, a mid-caste officer, reported the incident to command and recommended disciplinary action. The response that came back, signed by Scholar Q himself, read, "Leave them alone. Let them laugh." The ripple effects were enormous. The Zakari Empire was built on hierarchy and fear. High castes ruled, low castes obeyed, and the system was maintained by the unquestioned belief that the strong had a divine right to dominate the weak. Undermined this system at its foundations, because humor required a kind of mental freedom that the caste system was designed to prevent. When a drone laughed at a joke about a general, something shifted in the relationship between them. The general was no longer untouchable. The drone was no longer just a tool, and once that shift happened, it could not be reversed. Other species noticed. The galaxy had been watching humanity since the Battle of Sol. The broadcast had been intercepted by hundreds of civilizations, and the footage of 600 human ships tearing apart an armada 20 times their size had spread to every corner of known space. But it was not the battle that changed things. It was the laughter. Species that had been conquered by the Zakari, or by other empires like them, began to ask a question they had never asked before. What if the beings that ruled them were not actually terrifying? What if they were in fact ridiculous? The skull thrones and the litanies of inevitable subjugation were not symbols of invincible power, but were instead, and this was a thought so dangerous that it could topple civilizations, kind of silly, more disorienting. The caste system was softening. The drones were speaking up, not in rebellion, but in conversation, which was almost worse, because rebellion he would have known how to handle. His generals were confused and angry, and some of them were, quietly and reluctantly, starting to make the chittering sound themselves. Scholar Keel resigned from Imperial service. He moved to Earth, which surprised everyone, except Tanaka, who had apparently been expecting it. He settled in a city called Melbourne, and after 6 weeks of studying the local comedy scene, performed his first open mic night at a small club in the city center. His set was 12 minutes long. He walked on stage, all 9 feet of him, in traditional Zakari robes, and performed a dramatic, word-perfect reenactment of the litany of inevitable subjugation, complete with theatrical arm gestures and an increasingly ridiculous selection of props. He replaced the skull throne with a folding chair, armor over a floral Hawaiian shirt. He delivered the line, "Kneel or be rendered into dust and memory," while holding a rubber duck. The audience laughed so hard that 2 people had to leave the room to catch their breath. Kiel performed every weekend after that. His shows sold out within minutes. He became, against all odds, the most famous alien comedian in human history, and possibly the first comedian in Zakari history, period. His signature bit, the litany reenactment, evolved with every performance, growing more elaborate and absurd each time, and it killed every single time he did it. The final scene happened on Titan Station, which had grown from a hastily built diplomatic outpost into a bustling trade hub filled with beings from dozens of species. The corridors were noisy and colorful and alive in a way that no Jakari station had ever been. Admiral Tanaka and Lord Vethon stood together on the observation deck, looking out at the stars. Two glasses sat on the rail. The railing between them, one filled with a human drink, one filled with a Jakari equivalent that smelled like burning copper. They stood in comfortable silence for a while, the kind of silence that was only possible between people who had moved past enmity into something more complicated and more real. "Do your people ever stop laughing?" Vethon asked. Tanaka thought about it. She thought about the long, strange, violent, beautiful, terrible history of her species. The wars and the plagues and the famines and the bombs and the slow, stubborn refusal to ever give up or shut up or stop making jokes even when the world was ending. She thought about the trenches and the hospitals and the disaster zones and the refugee camps and every single dark and broken place where humans had gathered together and found something to laugh about, because the alternative was to stop fighting, and they had never once in their entire existence chosen to stop fighting. "If we did, we would have to take the universe seriously. And honestly," she gestured at the stars, at the ships drifting past the viewport, at the alien trade delegations arguing in the corridor behind them, at the distant glow of a galaxy that was slowly, messily, hilariously learning to laugh. "Look at it. It is funny." Vethon looked out at the stars. He looked at the small human woman beside him. He looked at the glass in his hand and at the reflection of his own golden eyes in the dark liquid. And then Lord Vethon, the Undying, supreme hegemon of the Zakari Imperial Dominion, conqueror of 900 worlds, made the sound. It was stronger now, warmer, fuller, not quite the same as a human laugh, but close, something that had been locked inside a species for 1,000 years, finally breaking free like light through a crack in a wall. He was getting better at it. And somewhere on Earth, in a small comedy club in Melbourne, a 9-foot alien, in a Hawaiian shirt, was bringing down the house. And the galaxy, the vast, ancient, terrified, beautiful galaxy, was just beginning to understand that the scariest thing in the universe was not a fleet or a weapon or a conqueror on a throne of skulls. It was a species that looked at the darkness between the stars and decided it was hilarious.